Story 1. John Matthews, a 35-year-old sound engineer, was no stranger to strange, antique recordings. His job required him to listen to old records, tapes, and even wax cylinders, digitizing them for modern consumption. He had a passion for uncovering lost music, a love for the forgotten sounds of the past. On a particularly rainy Sunday afternoon, John visited a local flea market, a treasure trove for old audio gear. The smell of damp cardboard and dust filled the air as he meandered through the stalls. He sifted through boxes of old records, his fingers blackened by dirt, when something unusual caught his eye. It was a battered cassette tape, encased in a clear plastic shell with no label or title. It looked out of place among the vinyl and 8-track tapes. The vendor, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and a raspy voice, looked at John with a curious smile when he held up the cassette. "You sure you want that one?" the man asked, his tone almost too cautious. "It's been with me a long time. Everyone who's taken it, brought it back." John, intrigued by the cryptic remark, dismissed it as an attempt to inflate the price. He paid the man, brushed off the warning, and headed home, unaware that this small, insignificant cassette would soon change his life forever. John arrived home, the rain still tapping on the windows, and eagerly went to his studio. He popped the cassette into his old player. It took a moment for the tape to start spinning, but when it did, a soft, melancholic melody filled the room. It was a piano piece, slow and haunting, yet mesmerizing. The sound was unlike anything John had ever heard before, deep, rich, and full of raw emotion, as though the very soul of the pianist was trapped within each note. For the first few minutes, John was captivated. But then, something odd began to happen. The music started to warp, like an old VHS tape that had been left in the sun too long. The notes bent and twisted, creating a discordant, unsettling sound. It felt as though the music was being played backward, but not quite. Suddenly, the tape stopped. John reached out to eject it, but before he could, the tape started playing again. Only this time, there was no music. Just silence. He turned up the volume, thinking there was something wrong with his player. That's when he heard it, a faint, distant voice, almost like a whisper, buried deep within the silence of the tape. "Help me." John's heart raced. He rewound the tape, trying to find the voice again, but it was gone. He convinced himself that it was just an audio artifact, a glitch in the old tape. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Over the next few days, John couldn't stop thinking about the cassette. It called to him, an unshakable urge pulling him back to the player. He played the tape every night, hoping to hear the voice again. But it never returned. Instead, he began to notice other strange things. The first incident happened in his studio. He was mixing a track when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. A silhouette, a person, maybe. But when he turned to look, no one was there. The next day, he found the cassette had been moved. It was no longer on the shelf where he had left it. Instead, it was sitting in the player, as if someone, or something, had put it there. His dreams, too, became consumed by the music. He would hear the haunting piano melody in his sleep, echoing through endless, dark hallways. The figure from the doorway appeared in these dreams, always standing at the edge of his vision, never speaking, just watching. John's obsession grew. He began researching old cassette tapes, trying to find out if anyone had experienced something similar. His late-night internet searches uncovered forums discussing haunted objects, cursed tapes, and lost recordings that were said to trap spirits. The more he read, the more the lines between reality and fiction began to blur. John's investigation led him to an obscure mention of a musician named Michael Reyes, a talented but troubled pianist from the 1980s. Reyes had been a rising star in the underground music scene, known for his eerie compositions that blended classical music with experimental sounds. His work was brilliant but unsettling, and as his fame grew, so did his erratic behavior. In 1987, Reyes mysteriously disappeared. His last known recording, an unreleased album, was said to have been lost, and with it, any trace of the musician. Some claimed that Reyes had been involved in dark rituals, others believed he had gone insane, his mind unraveling from the music he created. There were even rumors that his final album was cursed, that anyone who listened to it was haunted by his spirit. John couldn't shake the feeling that the cassette he had found was somehow connected to Reyes. The sound, the atmosphere, everything about it felt like something Reyes would have created. He searched for more information, but the deeper he dug, the more dead ends he hit. It wasn't until he contacted an old colleague in the music industry that he got a lead. The colleague remembered Reyes, not just for his music, but for the strange stories that followed him. One in particular stood out. Reyes had been obsessed with the idea that music could hold more than just notes. He believed it could capture the essence of the soul, that certain frequencies could open doorways to other dimensions. John's colleague warned him to be careful. Some things, he said, are better left unheard. John's obsession with the cassette grew. He spent hours replaying the tape, trying to unlock its secrets. The figure from his dreams began appearing more frequently, not just at the edge of his vision but in full view. He saw it in reflections, standing behind him in mirrors, windows, even in the reflection of his computer screen. Yet, no matter how much he stared at it, the figure never moved or spoke. His studio, once his sanctuary, became a place of dread. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen. His equipment would malfunction, recordings would erase themselves, and the cassette would randomly start playing, even when he wasn't in the room. His friends grew concerned. Claire, his closest friend and a skeptic of all things paranormal, noticed the change in him. She visited him one evening, trying to get him to talk about what was happening. "You've changed," she said, watching him as he sat in front of the cassette player, his eyes dark and hollow. "This isn't like you." But John couldn't explain it. He couldn't tell her about the figure, the voice, or the dreams. He didn't know how to. Every time he tried, the words got stuck in his throat. Claire, refusing to let John succumb to whatever dark force was at play, took matters into her own hands. She began researching Reyes, digging into old newspaper archives, music journals, and even consulting with paranormal experts. The stories she uncovered were more terrifying than she had expected. Reyes wasn't just a troubled musician, he had been involved in the occult. Witnesses from his final days spoke of strange rituals performed in his studio, of cryptic symbols painted on the walls, and of a growing madness that consumed him as he worked on his final album. There were whispers that Reyes had summoned something during one of these rituals, something that had taken root in his music. Claire confronted John with the information, but he brushed it off. He was too far gone, too consumed by the music. He couldn't stop listening to the tape, even as the haunting grew worse. He had become a prisoner of the music, just as Reyes had before him. The air in John's home had become unbearably thick with dread. Shadows clung to the corners of every room, and the figure that haunted John had begun to move closer, its presence no longer a distant silhouette but a tangible form. It would stand at the foot of his bed as he tried to sleep, its face always hidden by darkness, its breath like a cold wind on his skin. Claire had reached her limit. John was slipping further away, and she knew if she didn't intervene soon, he might be lost forever. After extensive research into occult rituals and curses, she found an ancient cleansing ritual said to sever bonds between cursed objects and their victims. It was risky, and there was no guarantee it would work, but it was the only hope she had left. One night, Claire arrived at John's house with candles, chalk, and incense, everything needed for the ritual. John barely acknowledged her presence. He was sitting in his studio, the cassette playing on a loop, his eyes hollow, as if the music had drained the life from him. "John," Claire said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He flinched but didn't look at her. "I can hear him, Claire," John whispered, his voice shaky. "Reyes, he's in the music." Claire knelt beside him, her voice gentle but determined. "I'm going to help you, John. But you need to trust me. We have to destroy the tape." John's eyes widened in panic. "No. I can't. It's the only way to understand. I have to finish it." Claire shook her head, her heart aching for her friend. She could see the toll the cassette had taken on him, his sunken cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes, the trembling of his hands. He was a man on the edge of madness. "Please, John. Let me help you." For a moment, John hesitated. He looked at Claire, a flicker of the old John shining through the haze of obsession. He nodded weakly. Claire set to work immediately, drawing a large circle on the floor with chalk and placing candles at its edges. She lit the incense, its pungent aroma filling the room, and began chanting the words of the ritual, a mix of Latin and ancient tongues. The air seemed to shift, as if the house itself was holding its breath. John sat in the center of the circle, clutching the cassette. His hands trembled as the music continued to play, growing louder with each passing second. The figure, the dark, looming shadow, began to move toward them, no longer content to remain at the edges of John's vision. The room grew cold, the temperature plummeting until Claire could see her breath in the air. The candles flickered, threatening to go out as the entity drew closer. "Stay with me, John," Claire urged, her voice growing louder as she continued the chant. "Don't let it take you." The figure was almost upon them now, a towering presence that seemed to warp the very space around it. Its face was still hidden, but Claire could feel its malevolent gaze boring into them. It reached out, a long, shadowy hand stretching toward John. Suddenly, the cassette player stopped. The music cut out, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a voice, Rhea's voice, echoed through the room, not from the cassette player but from everywhere at once. "You can't save him," the voice whispered. "He's mine now." John cried out, clutching his head as the figure's hand neared him, the air around them crackling with dark energy. Claire, her heart racing, poured everything she had into the final words of the ritual. The candles flared brightly, and a gust of wind blew through the room as if the very house had come alive. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a bad TV signal, but it wasn't gone yet. John's eyes rolled back in his head, his body convulsing as the entity tried to take control of him. "John!" Claire screamed. She grabbed the cassette from his hands and, without thinking, smashed it against the floor. The tape shattered, pieces scattering across the chalk circle. There was a deafening screech, like nails on a chalkboard, as the figure let out a furious wail. It lashed out one last time before dissolving into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. John collapsed, gasping for air, his body limp. Claire knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered, cradling his head in her lap. "It's over." In the days that followed, John began to recover. The dark circles under his eyes faded, and his old self slowly returned. He didn't remember much of what had happened during the height of his obsession, and Claire never told him everything. Some things were better left unsaid. They disposed of the shattered cassette pieces, burning them to ensure that whatever dark force had inhabited the tape was truly gone. But even as the flames consumed the plastic and magnetic tape, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of it. John returned to work, though he avoided anything related to old recordings or lost tapes. He couldn't bring himself to listen to music for a while. The piano melodies from the cassette still haunted his dreams from time to time, but they were distant now, like echoes from a past life. Claire continued her research into Michael Reyes, determined to uncover the full truth of what had happened. She found more stories of people who had come into contact with his cursed recordings, all of them ending in tragedy. The music, it seemed, had a life of its own, a haunting melody that refused to be silenced. Months later, as John and Claire sat together in his studio, laughing over a shared memory, the laughter was suddenly cut short. A soft, familiar melody filled the room. The piano. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Claire looked at him, her face pale. The music was coming from the studio speakers. The same haunting piano piece that had started it all. They exchanged a look of horror. The cassette had been destroyed. The music should have been gone. But it wasn't. As the final note played, a voice whispered through the speakers, clear and unmistakable. "Help me." The end, it seemed, was only the beginning. Story 2. You ever come across something so seemingly innocent but it leaves an impression on you that you can't shake? Something that feels wrong, but you can't explain why at first. That's how I felt when I found that old mixtape. Let me tell you what happened, and you can decide for yourself if it was all just coincidence, or something darker. It all started about 5 years ago. I was visiting my grandparents' old house, a place filled with dusty relics from their past. They had both passed away, and it was my job to help clear out their attic. My grandparents had always been a bit eccentric, collecting random odds and ends from all over the world. They had everything from old books to antique trinkets to vinyl records. That attic was like stepping into a time capsule from another era. Among the boxes of forgotten memories, I found a stack of cassette tapes. Now, this wasn't too surprising. My grandparents were big into music in the 70s and 80s, so they had tons of records and tapes. But this one tape caught my eye immediately. Unlike the others, which were labeled with band names or years, this one had no markings on it. No artist, no tracklist. Just a plain black cassette with "For You" scrawled on it in what looked like red marker. But it wasn't marker. It was something thicker, almost like it was scratched into the plastic itself. I figured it was just an old mixtape someone had made for one of them, probably something sentimental. So, I tossed it in my bag with some other tapes I thought might be fun to listen to later. It didn't feel like a big deal at the time, just another dusty relic. Fast forward a few days, I'm back home and I'm feeling a bit nostalgic. I'd always been into retro stuff, and I still had my old cassette player. I thought it'd be fun to go through those tapes I found, maybe rediscover some old music from my grandparents' younger days. So, one evening, I popped in the mystery tape, the one that said, "For You." At first, I didn't hear anything. The tape seemed like it was blank. But just as I was about to take it out, this low, eerie hum started coming through the speakers. It wasn't music, at least not any kind of music I'd ever heard. It was this strange, droning sound, like a single note being held out forever, stretching on and on. Beneath it, if I listened closely enough, I could hear something else, almost like whispering. I turned up the volume a little, trying to make out what the whispers were saying, but they were too faint. And then, after a few minutes of this bizarre hum and whispering, the droning stopped, and something else began to play. It was music, but not the kind of music I was expecting. It was a piano, but every note felt off. Like someone was playing an old, out-of-tune piano in a dark, empty room. The melody was slow and haunting, the kind of tune that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And as the music played, I started to feel this strange sensation, like I wasn't alone in the room anymore. The air felt colder, and there was this heaviness that seemed to settle over everything. But I didn't stop the tape. I was curious, maybe too curious for my own good. The piano kept playing, and that whispering sound came back, only this time it was clearer. It wasn't just random whispers, it was like someone was trying to speak to me, directly through the music. Then, a voice, soft at first but unmistakable, started speaking over the piano. It was a woman's voice, delicate but hollow, like she was speaking from far away. "Why did you leave me?" she said. "Why didn't you wait?" I froze. The voice wasn't part of a song, it wasn't lyrics, it was like someone was right there, speaking directly to me. I paused the tape, my heart racing. For a moment, the room felt completely silent, but that cold sensation remained. I told myself it was just some weird recording, maybe some kind of experimental music or sound art. After all, there's a lot of strange stuff out there, right? But something about it felt personal. Like whoever had made this tape wasn't just recording music, they were trying to reach out to someone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the tape, about that voice. Why did it feel like it was talking to me? I tried to brush it off, but when I closed my eyes, I could still hear that haunting piano melody playing in my head. The next day, I decided to listen to the tape again. I figured if I played it all the way through, maybe it would make sense. Maybe there was an explanation, some kind of message hidden in the music. So, I sat down, put the headphones on, and hit play. The hum came back first, then the whispers, and finally the piano. But this time, the voice was different. It wasn't just asking why someone had left, it was angrier, more desperate. "Don't ignore me," it said. "You can't ignore me." I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice sounded closer, more real. I stopped the tape again, my hand shaking as I took off the headphones. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a tape. There was something else, something alive in it. I tried to forget about it. I even thought about throwing the tape away, but some part of me couldn't let go of it. I felt drawn to it, almost like it was calling me back. That night, things got worse. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of music playing. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized it was real. The piano melody was playing again, coming from my cassette player. The strange thing was, I hadn't put the tape back in. It was still sitting on my desk where I'd left it. But the player was on, and the music was filling the room, that same haunting tune. I got up and unplugged the player, but the music kept playing, echoing through the dark room. I felt panic rising in my chest. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? And then, I heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't coming from the cassette, it was coming from the corner of the room. A faint whisper, just like before, but now it was unmistakable. "You have to listen," the voice said, "or I'll never leave you." I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed the cassette and threw it into a drawer, slamming it shut as if that could somehow trap whatever was in the tape. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an eerie, oppressive silence. For the next few days, I avoided my room as much as possible. I slept on the couch, kept the lights on, and tried to pretend like none of it had happened. But every night, at exactly 3 a.m., I could hear the piano again, faint but unmistakable, playing somewhere in the distance. The more I ignored it, the worse it got. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving across the room, figures standing at the edge of my vision. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, I was falling apart. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something, anything, to stop it. So, I called my friend Mark. He was into all kinds of paranormal stuff, ghosts, hauntings, you name it. If anyone could help me, it was him. When I told Mark about the tape, he didn't seem surprised. He said he'd heard about things like this before, objects that carried some kind of dark energy, spirits trapped in the physical world, that kind of thing. He offered to come over and take a look at it. When Mark arrived, he brought a bunch of gear with him, EMF meters, cameras, and even some old ritual books. I wasn't sure how much I believed in all that, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. We set up in my room, the cassette player at the center of it all. Mark started running his equipment, and almost immediately, the EMF meter spiked. "There's definitely something here," he said, his voice calm but serious. "Whatever's in that tape, it's not just music." Mark suggested we try a ritual to cleanse the tape, to sever whatever connection it had to this presence. We gathered some candles, incense, and a few other things he'd brought along, and we started the ritual. As Mark chanted, the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the floor like dark, twisting vines. The piano music began to play again, but this time it was coming from the cassette itself, even though it wasn't plugged in. Then, the voice came back, but now it was louder, angrier. "Don't leave me," it screamed, the sound reverberating through the room. Mark continued the ritual, his voice steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The shadows began to apologize for the abrupt stop. "Let's continue the story from where it left off." Mark continued the ritual, his voice steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The shadows began to swirl around the room like a living thing, moving faster and faster as the music grew louder. The voice, angry, desperate, echoed through the air, shaking the walls with its fury. "You can't leave me." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the candles blew out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. The music stopped, and for a moment, everything was still, eerily quiet. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. Then, out of nowhere, a deafening crash came from the cassette player. The tape itself had burst apart, the ribbon spilling out like black entrails. The air felt thick, like the room itself was pressing in on us. And that's when I saw her. In the corner of the room, where the shadows had gathered most densely, a figure was slowly taking shape, a woman, her eyes dark and hollow, her face twisted in a grotesque expression of sorrow and rage. She wasn't fully solid, but there was no doubt she was there, watching us. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We need to get out, now," he shouted. We ran out of the room, slamming the door behind us, and collapsed in the hallway, gasping for breath. The temperature had returned to normal, and the house was silent once again. The cassette lay destroyed in the room, and the figure was gone, at least for now. Mark looked at me, pale and shaken. "That wasn't a regular haunting," he said quietly. "Whatever was in that tape, it was holding something trapped. We might have released it." For days after, I was terrified to return to my room. Mark said that the ritual might have stopped the worst of it, but there was no guarantee the presence was fully gone. I kept hearing whispers late at night, the faint sound of that cursed piano melody echoing through my mind. I couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the woman from the tape, staring at me from the corner of the room. Eventually, I decided to leave the house. I couldn't stay there anymore. Whatever was trapped in that cassette had latched onto me, and I feared that as long as I stayed, it would never leave me alone. But even after moving, the nightmares didn't stop. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that haunting piano melody, faint but unmistakable, playing somewhere in the distance. And sometimes, just for a second, I catch a glimpse of her, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. The tape may have been destroyed, but the presence it carried is still out there. I don't know if it's truly gone or if it's just waiting for the right moment to come back. All I know is that once something like that gets its hooks into you, it's almost impossible to escape. So if you ever come across an old cassette, especially one that seems out of place, with no markings or a cryptic message, don't play it. Trust me, some things are better left forgotten. And if you do play it, well, just be ready for what might be listening on the other end. Story 3. Alright, this is gonna take a while, so make sure you're comfortable. What I'm about to tell you, well, let's just say it's not something I like talking about too often. But it's been weighing on me, and honestly, I think you should hear it. Because once you get involved with something like this, it sticks with you forever. So, where do I even start? It was last year, maybe a little over a year ago now. I was visiting my cousin, Dan. Dan's always been eccentric. You know the type, always into obscure stuff, retro gadgets, vinyl records, cassette tapes, all that vintage music gear. He loves the sound of analog, says it has a soul that digital music lacks. His house is full of old school equipment, dusty turntables, shelves of vinyl, tapes stacked so high they look like they're about to topple over. It's the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped back in time the second you walk through the door. Anyway, I hadn't seen him in a while, so I decided to pay him a visit. We were close growing up, but life kind of got in the way, you know. So I showed up at his place, expecting a chill weekend of music, beers, and catching up. But when I got there, something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was just the way Dan looked, like he hadn't slept in days. Or maybe it was the atmosphere in his house. The air felt heavier than I remembered. It was subtle, but there was this tension, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Dan greeted me at the door with this strange smile, like he was trying to act normal, but his eyes were darting around the room, like he was waiting for something to happen. We sat down, cracked open a couple of beers, and I asked him how he was doing. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at his drink, swirling it around, lost in thought. Finally, he sighed and said, "I found something. Something strange. And I don't know what to do about it." Now, you have to understand, Dan isn't the kind of guy to get freaked out easily. He's always been the laid-back one, the rational one. So for him to be acting like this, I knew something serious was going on. I asked him what he was talking about, and that's when he told me about the tape. Dan had been at this flea market a few towns over, just doing his usual rummaging through old records and tapes, looking for hidden gems. That's when he found it, this plain, black cassette, tucked away in a box of old junk. It had no label, no writing, nothing to indicate what was on it. Just a solid black tape in a cracked, clear case. Naturally, Dan was intrigued. He's always been a sucker for a mystery. So, he bought it for a couple of bucks, didn't think much of it at the time. The guy selling it didn't even know where it had come from. He just shrugged when Dan asked about it, said it was probably part of a collection he'd bought in bulk. When Dan got home, he decided to play the tape. That's when things started to get weird. He said the moment he hit play, the room felt different. The first few seconds were just silence, followed by this low hum, almost like static but, not quite. It was deeper, like the sound was coming from far away, from somewhere you couldn't quite reach. And then, the music started. Except, it wasn't music. Not in any traditional sense, anyway. It was more like a collection of random, discordant notes, strung together in a way that didn't make any sense. The melody, if you could even call it that, was unsettling, like something was intentionally off about it. But the strangest part was the voice. Dan said there was this faint whisper, barely audible, beneath the music. At first, he thought it was just part of the track, some kind of experimental, artsy thing. But the more he listened, the more he realized the voice wasn't following the rhythm of the music. It was separate, like it was trying to say something, but it was being drowned out. Dan listened to the entire tape, and by the end, he was more confused than anything else. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. He told himself it was just a weird piece of music, nothing to get worked up about. But that night, something woke him up. He was lying in bed, half asleep, when he heard it, a faint melody, echoing through the house. At first, he thought it was coming from outside, maybe a neighbor playing music. But as he listened, he realized it was the same melody from the tape. The exact same one. The problem? The tape wasn't playing. It was still in the player, across the room, turned off. He got up, checked the player, nothing. But the music didn't stop. It was like it was coming from the walls, surrounding him. He said it felt like it was in his head, like the sound was crawling around inside his skull, burrowing deeper. He tried to ignore it, convinced himself he was just tired, that it was all in his mind. But over the next few days, things only got worse. The music would start playing randomly, even when the tape was nowhere near the player. He'd hear it in the middle of the night, soft and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away, but always just loud enough to keep him awake. Then, the shadows started. At first, it was just out of the corner of his eye, quick, darting movements that he could almost convince himself weren't real. But then they became more persistent. He'd see them in mirrors, standing just behind him, barely visible. And every time he turned around, there'd be nothing there. But he knew. He could feel it. I could tell Dan was getting really freaked out, but I wasn't sure what to think. Part of me thought he was just scaring himself, you know. Sometimes, when you get too deep into something, your mind starts playing tricks on you. But I've known Dan a long time, and he's not the type to lose it over nothing. He begged me to come over that weekend, said he needed me to see this for myself. So, I agreed. I figured maybe if I was there, I could help him figure out what was going on, maybe there was some logical explanation for all of this. I got to his place on a Friday evening, and right away, I could tell he hadn't been sleeping. He had dark circles under his eyes, his hands were shaking, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting something to jump out at him at any moment. He didn't waste any time before showing me the tape. I remember holding it in my hands, turning it over, looking for any sign of what might be on it. But like he said, there was nothing. Just a black, unmarked cassette. It felt wrong, somehow. I can't explain it, but just touching it gave me this uneasy feeling, like I shouldn't be holding it. But I brushed it off. We put the tape in the player, and the moment it started, I knew what Dan had been talking about. The music, if you can even call it that, it was disturbing. It felt off in a way that I couldn't put into words. And that whispering, it was there, faint, like someone was trying to speak to me, but I couldn't make out the words. Dan turned it off after a few minutes. He looked at me, eyes wide, waiting for my reaction. I didn't know what to say. I mean, how do you explain something like that? I was trying to stay rational, telling myself it was just some weird, experimental music, but deep down, I felt it too. Something was wrong with that tape. That night, I stayed over at Dan's place, and I swear to you, I experienced it. I woke up in the middle of the night to that same eerie melody, playing softly in the background. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was so faint, like it was drifting in from another room. But when I got up to check, the cassette player wasn't even plugged in. That's when the footsteps started. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking through the house. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was probably just Dan getting up to check on something. But when I peeked out of the bedroom, I saw Dan's door was closed. He was still in his room, fast asleep. The footsteps grew louder, moving through the hallway toward the living room. I stood frozen in the doorway, too scared to move. And then, they stopped. Right outside Dan's door. I held my breath, waiting for something. Anything. But the silence that followed was even worse. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, but eventually, I crept back to bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I didn't sleep much after that. How could I? Every little noise, every creak of the house, sent my heart racing. But eventually, the sun came up, and I felt a little better. Daylight has a way of making things feel more normal, you know. The next morning, Dan was quiet. He didn't ask me if I heard anything, and I didn't bring it up. It was like we both silently agreed not to talk about it. But I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He was breaking down, slowly, like the weight of whatever this thing was eating away at him. We spent most of the day trying to distract ourselves. We didn't even touch the cassette. But every now and then, I'd catch Dan glancing toward the stereo, like he was afraid it might start playing on its own again. By the time night rolled around, we were both on edge. That second night, that's when everything came to a head. It started the same way as before. That faint, distant melody, drifting through the house like a ghost. But this time, it was louder, clearer. Dan heard it too. We both sat up in our beds, staring at the ceiling, listening. Neither of us said a word, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing: it's getting closer. Then, the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing through the house. Dan and I looked at each other, and without speaking, we both got up and crept toward the hallway. We stood there, listening, as the footsteps grew louder. They stopped right in front of us, just outside the living room. Dan was shaking. I'd never seen him like that before, not even when we were kids. But before I could say anything, the living room door slammed shut, so hard it rattled the walls. We both jumped back, hearts pounding in our chests. And then, the whispering. It was everywhere, all around us, like a chorus of voices, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. The sound was suffocating, crawling under my skin, making my head spin. Dan was backing away, his eyes wide with terror. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him toward the front door, but he wouldn't move. "It wants something," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It wants us to listen." I didn't know what he meant at the time. But then, Dan broke free of my grip and ran back to the stereo. He grabbed the cassette, his hands trembling as he shoved it into the player and hit play. The moment the music started, the whispering stopped. The footsteps, the slamming doors, everything, it all went quiet. But the music, it was different this time. The melody was clearer, more structured, almost like it was guiding us. And the voice, the one beneath the music, it wasn't whispering anymore. It was speaking. And this time, we could hear it. "Don't leave." Dan's face went pale. He looked at me, his mouth hanging open in shock. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "It's talking to us." I nodded, but I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was the tape alive? Could it really be communicating with us? It didn't make any sense. But before I could think too much about it, the voice came again, louder this time. "Stay here." Dan's eyes filled with tears. He looked down at the tape, then back at me. I think it's trapped," he said. "I think it wants us to help it." I didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was clear: whatever was on that tape, it wasn't going to let us go until we listened. We stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the eerie melody, the voice growing fainter and fainter, until finally, the tape clicked off. For a moment, everything was still. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. But then, the door behind us creaked open. Slowly, cautiously, we turned to face it. There was no one there. Just an empty hallway. Dan and I exchanged a glance, and without saying a word, we both knew what we had to do. We had to get rid of that tape. Whatever was on it, whatever it was trying to tell us, it wasn't worth the risk. We couldn't keep living like this, trapped in this nightmare. So, we did the only thing we could think of. We took the tape out back, grabbed a hammer from Dan's toolbox, and smashed it to pieces. The plastic shattered under the weight of the hammer, the tape unspooled in a tangled mess on the ground. And for the first time in days, the house felt still. That night, I slept better than I had in a long time. The music was gone, the whispering was gone, and the footsteps were gone. It was like a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. But the story doesn't end there. A few weeks later, Dan called me. He sounded different. Lighter, happier, like his old self again. He said everything had gone back to normal, that he hadn't heard the music or the voices since we destroyed the tape. But then, just before he hung up, he said something that sent a chill down my spine. You know, he said, I was going through some old boxes in the attic the other day, and I found something strange. What? I asked, my heart sinking. Another tape, he said. It's identical to the first one. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Dan laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh you make when you know you're screwed, but you're trying to pretend everything's fine. I'm not gonna play it, he said. I just thought you should know. And that's it. That's the last time I talked to Dan. I've tried calling him, but he doesn't answer. I've been by his place, but it's empty, like he just disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he played that second tape. But something tells me he did. And now, well, I can't stop thinking about it. I keep hearing that melody in my head, late at night, when the house is quiet. It's faint, but it's there. And I can't help but wonder. Did I bring it home with me?